Hi, this is Anita from the Dusty Roads podcast. Today I want to talk about something which I think is really quite interesting. It's about how geography influences culture. Whether a country or city is in the mountains, the desert, or seas, it can actually influence the culture. And there's many reasons why. So I find this so fascinating that, basically where you live can basically influence, or your geography around you can influence the culture of the area that you live. Mountains, let's talk first about mountains. Mountains are both barriers and sanctuaries. The rugged terrain and isolation often led to developing distinct cultures and dialects and traditions. In other words, people who traditionally lived in the mountains maybe were very isolated and didn't see many foreigners or other people. In fact, many of them could have gone hundreds and hundreds of years without seeing anybody. That historically, mountainous regions had been difficult to invade, maybe foster the sense of independent communities that would have unique customs. So there's many ways that mountains sort of could shape culture. One would be isolation and distinct identity. People in the mountains, they often developed a strong local identity and self-reliance. Could be limited outside influence and dialect, clothing, traditions. Economic adaptations. They learned to adapt economically. They learned to combat steep slopes, herding animals, like yaks or sheep or goats, became common up the mountains. You go into some places in Vietnam here, the mountain communities, and you see where many of the Hmong, the hill tribes, have adapted to be able to do terrace type of farming, where they've learned to be able to farm up the steep mountains without any type of equipment or machinery. So they basically have learned to adapt to mountain life. Mountains too could also have a spiritual significance. They could be, many mountains are considered sacred. This could influence local beliefs and pilgrimage and culture. Houses could be built with steep roofs to withstand heavy snowfall, or settlements are often, clustered in valleys to protect against the harsh winter conditions if the mountains was in a winter area. For example, where I've spent a lot of time in the United States, Utah, in the Rocky Mountains, you can see how maybe even that culture of that area of America, because of the snow, adapted. Resilience and survival skills. Mountain dwellers often develop this culture of resilience and cooperation because they understood the survival of the terrain is very, very important. There's some tourist destinations where mountains have shaped culture. One of my favorite is Tibet in China. I've actually been to Tibet in China, and we once took it was an 8-hour journey in from Chengdu into Tibet in China. And I could tell you there, the mountains definitely shaped the culture there because of the fact that the people were not used to having a lot of outsiders. They were, very much, they lived their life the way they've always been living it, that it truly did shape their culture. Of course, another one would be the Swiss Alps in Switzerland, or the Andes Mountains in Peru, or the Rocky Mountains, as I mentioned before, in the US and Canada. Mountains actually in many ways have been known to shape culture and the way of life. Another thing would be deserts, extreme environments that can test human endurance. And, they can be extremely hot, depending upon where they're at. They can have harsh climates. Deserts, you can have desert storms that blow through. A lot of times the deserts, many cultures in the deserts have nomadic traditions. They rely on nomadic lifestyles. I remember when I went to Mongolia and was out in the Gobi Desert and stayed in a Mongolian gyr, or what they know as yurt. And that 4 times a year, the nomads would move their cattle from place to place. And this was a nomadic lifestyle that they had chosen. And, and I saw them too, with extremely resilient. It was quite fascinating to see how they had solar panels at their campsite, where basically, even though they were living this nomadic lifestyle out in tents, they still had some of the modern technology with the solar panels. They, develop innovation with water conservation method. The other thing I saw out there in the Gobi Desert in Mongolia was that they had these big buckets where they would collect rainwater. and they bring water in. You see architecture and how it's adapted. They'll have different clothing, a lot of times loose, long clothing like robes or head covering to protect them from the sandstorms, extreme temperatures. Many desert cultures have deep spiritual connections, to the land, where traditions, rooted in storytelling and survival wisdom. There's many destinations where the deserts have shaped the culture. The Sahara Desert, of course, the Arabian Desert, deserts in South and South Central America. There's a Chilean desert. So all of these places have been shaped by culture. The last one, of course, would be the sea and the oceans. And, coastal regions have always been about trade, migration, cultural exchange centers. That's because, they would have ships come in and ships go out. And so for hundreds of years, they've been a place where it's been a place of cultural exchange. There's always been sort of like a maritime economy. Fishing, shipbuilding, and trade usually thrive in these coastal cultures. Their culinary influences, they could be influenced by, spices and other things from other parts of the world. They often become places of cultural exchange, like a melting pot of different cultures. Many great civilizations from such as the Vikings, were shaped with their ability to navigate the seas. So navigation and exploration became very important. Many of the coastal communities will have many festivals and traditions which are related to the sea, honoring deities, fishing, and maritime history and other things. So, some places where the sea could shape the culture, you could say Venice, Italy, definitely with all of the waterways there, within Greece itself, and of course, Japan, were all places where, the culture has been shaped due to being an access with or near the waterways. When you look at cultures or places around the world and you see some of their cultures, I really felt like this is something that's really interesting, because something we often don't really think about when we think about cultures, but we think about how did, where they're located, the location of where they're at, how it really shaped the culture and that region. And, not just the culture, but also the politics and other things were shaped really by the location. Whether they were, in a mountain where they became isolated for long periods of time, they were in a desert where maybe life was brutal and more nomadic lifestyles, or on the sea where basically there was a lot of maritime trade, there was exploration and other things going on, all would shape the culture of a region. If you're interested in being able to learn more about this and see some great photos on this, you can check out our blog on how geography influences culture, mountains, deserts, and seas. We'll put a link in the description below. We'd like to thank you for joining with us today, being part of our community. And if you are not part of our community yet, we hope you'll press that subscribe button and you'll subscribe to us and be part of our community. Thank you so much.